86 years old, Tom Brokaw has earned the right to say exactly what he thinks. He is the last of a dying breed. The man who stood at the Berlin Wall as history crumbled around him, who narrated the closing chapters of the 20th century with a voice that sounded like expensive mahogany and unwavering authority. For decades, he kept his professional opinions close to his chest, tucked neatly behind the discipline of a man who understood that the anchor's job was to report the story, not become one. But something has shifted. The legend has finally opened up about the woman who now commands his old stomping grounds, and what he has to say is anything but predictable. Tom Brokaw does not deal in empty compliments. When a man of his stature and experience chooses to speak, the industry listens. So, when word began circulating that Brokaw had been privately praising Savannah Guthrie in terms that went well beyond polite professional courtesy, people took notice. According to those close to him, he has described her as having the legal brain of a prosecutor and the relatability of a neighbor. For anyone who understands the Brokaw standard, that is not just a compliment, it is a coronation. Tom always believed that great journalism required two things above all else: the facts delivered straight and a story told well. In Savannah, he sees both qualities living comfortably in the same person, which is rarer than most people realize. What makes his endorsement particularly meaningful is the context surrounding it. The transition from the Brokaw era to the modern today show was not a graceful handoff. It was chaotic, painful, and at times deeply humiliating for the institution he helped build. When Matt Lauer's career collapsed in a storm of scandal in 2017, NBC News did not just lose an anchor, it lost its footing. The house shook, and into that wreckage stepped Savannah Guthrie, who did something almost no one in the old guard would have known how to do. She sat at that desk, looked directly into the camera, and admitted she was heartbroken. She told the audience she was processing the news right alongside them. It was honest, it was vulnerable, and it was the opposite of everything Tom's generation had been trained to project. In Tom's era, an anchor who showed emotion on air was considered professionally compromised. In Savannah's era, an anchor who doesn't show emotion is considered untrustworthy. Brokaw understands this distinction. His recent comments are not the reluctant admission of a man dragged into the present against his will. They are the observations of someone who has watched the tectonic plates of broadcast journalism shift for decades and has arrived, with some degree of wonder, at the conclusion that Savannah Guthrie is not just surviving the new landscape, she is the one who defined it. He has noted her steely resolve and her prosecutorial edge, a direct nod to her law degree, which she wields in interviews with the precision of a surgeon. There is something almost poetic about a man who spent his career being the final word on American events, now sitting in a leather chair somewhere in Montana, nodding with approval as a former litigator traps a politician in a logic loop on live television. To fully appreciate what Savannah has built, you have to understand what Tom built first. His story begins in South Dakota, as far from the neon glow of 30 Rock as geographically possible. He had a voice that seemed destined for radio before he ever reached adulthood. But more importantly, he had a restless, frontier energy that refused to be contained by a 9-to-5 existence. He worked his way through local stations, learned the brutal economics of the news business, where being second meant being forgotten, and eventually arrived in the big leagues just as American journalism was entering its golden age. By the time the 70s gave way to the 80s, Tom Brokaw was not just an anchor. He was one of the three men, alongside Peter Jennings and Dan Rather, who collectively decided what 100 million Americans understood about the world they lived in. The newsroom of that era was nothing like the polished glass and chrome environments of today. It was loud, smoky, chaotic, and unforgiving. There were no reliable teleprompters, no instant fact-checking, and certainly no social media teams managing anyone's personal brand. You had to be sharp, fast, and emotionally bulletproof. Tom thrived in it. Whether he was covering Watergate, bearing witness to the devastation of Vietnam, or standing at the Berlin Wall in 1989 as the Iron Curtain finally gave way, Brokaw was the steady hand that kept the national narrative from spinning into panic. If Tom said it happened, America believed it happened. That kind of trust is almost impossible to imagine in today's media environment, and he earned every bit of it. But the golden age had a dark side. The career consumed everything. Holidays spent in hotel rooms in countries most people couldn't locate on a map, birthdays missed, and the relentless pressure of being the person a nation turns to during a crisis, it all added up. The voice of God persona demanded a level of perfection that left very little room for humanity. When Tom finally stepped down from the nightly news in 2004, it genuinely felt like the end of an era. People grieved it. He had been the chronicler of the greatest generation, a term he literally coined, and his departure felt like the closing of a chapter in American life. He didn't disappear, though. He watched from a distance as the internet dismantled the gatekeeping structures that had given his era its authority. He watched as the news shifted from what happened to how do we feel about what happened. And he watched, with what must have been considerable curiosity, as a sharp-minded former lawyer named Savannah Guthrie began making her presence felt in the building where he had spent his life. Savannah's ascent was nothing like Tom's. She did not come up through the slow, deliberate pipeline of local news and evening broadcasts. She was a litigator first, someone trained to find the weakness in an argument before the other side even finished making it. When she crossed from the courtroom to the newsroom, she brought that energy into a workplace that was, by most accounts, still operating largely on the cultural assumptions of a previous generation. She did not walk into 30 Rock and find the keys waiting for her. She stood in the freezing rain outside the White House at 4 in the morning. She did the grunt work, and gradually, people noticed something unusual about her. She could explain a Supreme Court ruling in plain language over a glass of wine, and then, in the same breath, make a powerful politician deeply uncomfortable with a single well-placed question. When she joined the Today Show in 2011, the program was already in the middle of a complicated transition. The audience was loyal but wary. Then the Lauer scandal hit, and suddenly Savannah was not just a co-host. She was the person responsible for keeping a beloved American institution from collapsing under the weight of its own scandal. The way she handled that moment defined her career. She did not retreat behind professionalism or carefully worded statements. She was simply unflinchingly human. She told the audience she was shocked and saddened, and because she was clearly telling the truth, they believed her. The Savannah era of the Today Show did not begin when she was hired. It began in that moment of honest, unscripted vulnerability. What she built from there is genuinely remarkable. She redefined the morning host as a category. Before her, you were either the serious news person or the warm lifestyle presence, two separate roles that rarely overlapped without awkwardness. Savannah decided she could be both simultaneously without apology or identity crisis. She could interview a head of state with the focused intensity of a prosecuting attorney and then pivot to a segment about home organization without losing an ounce of her credibility. That kind of range takes years to develop and an exceptional kind of self-possession to maintain under the scrutiny of millions of daily viewers. The critics, predictably, sharpened their knives. There were those who questioned whether two women co-hosting the show could work, as though 50 years of men doing it had been ordained by natural law rather than institutional habit. Savannah ignored them and kept leaning into her strengths. Her interviewing style became her signature, a warm, almost conversational approach that lulls guests into a false sense of security before she quietly closes the trap. It is brilliant to watch, and it is precisely the quality that eventually caused Tom Brokaw to sit up and take real notice. Both of them have also had to navigate the deeply personal in a very public way. Tom's diagnosis of multiple myeloma in 2013 was a confrontation with mortality that no number of career achievements could prepare a person for. The man who had reported from war zones without flinching was now facing something he could not outrun or outwork. He handled it with characteristic dignity, writing about what he called his lucky life and the unexpected grace of staring at a visible horizon. His 80s have been defined by a gradual, sometimes painful shedding of the identity that carried him for 60 years, learning to be a husband and grandfather rather than a network institution. Savannah's personal struggles have been different, but no less significant. Her path to motherhood involved IVF, uncertainty, and the particular exhaustion of building a family while simultaneously managing one of the most demanding jobs in television. When she nearly lost sight in one eye after an accident involving her son and a toy train, she faced the possibility that a career built on presence and perception might be over. She came back wearing glasses, looking exactly as frightened as she had every right to look, and she told the story honestly. Again, she let the audience in rather than shutting them out. It is a pattern that has defined her entire career. This is where their connection runs deepest, despite the 40 years between them. Both understand from lived experience that the anchor's mask eventually cracks. For Tom, it cracked under illness and the weight of age. For Savannah, it has cracked repeatedly under the unpredictable pressure of real life. Brokaw's admiration for her is not simply professional respect for a skilled broadcaster. It is the recognition of a fellow survivor, someone who kept showing up on the days when showing up was the hardest thing imaginable. What Brokaw is ultimately acknowledging by speaking up now is that the world has changed in ways that are irreversible, and that Savannah Guthrie is exactly the right person for the world that exists. The era of the granite desk anchor, the untouchable voice delivering capital T truth to a passive, grateful nation, is finished. Authenticity has replaced objectivity as the currency of trust. If audiences do not feel that they know you, they will not believe you. It is a fundamentally different contract between journalist and viewer, and it requires a fundamentally different kind of broadcaster to honor it. Tom Brokaw built the road. Savannah Guthrie is driving on it at speed, in conditions he never had to navigate, carrying a responsibility he would likely find both familiar and astonishing. His decision to give her flowers, as the saying goes, while she can still smell them, that is not sentimentality. It is one storyteller recognizing another. The anchor, as a cultural archetype, may well be dying, but the storyteller, as Brokaw himself seems to understand, has never mattered more.